Global competition is increasing at a steady pace. How come some regions develop and grow while others decline? And how come some companies can expand their business in fierce global competition while others are forced to shut down? One important answer is clusters that foster competitive firms and innovations. Clusters and innovation have also come to the forefront in policymaking. How can we design policies at international, national, regional, and local levels that strengthen innovation and competitiveness? These are some of the issues that will be discussed by several European experts in this series of programs on clusters, moderated by Professor Örjan Sölvell from Stockholm School of Economics.
So, welcome back to the second program in the series on clusters. Today we're going to talk about cluster policy. Cluster policy can be discussed and described at different levels, and we will talk about 6 different levels here today. First at the top you see policies here in Europe at the level of the European Union. Then sometimes we talk about macro regions, where we develop policies for a range of neighboring countries, such as the Baltic Sea region or the Danube region. We also have national policies and regional policies, and sometimes around the larger cities we also have city regional policies, and of course also local policies. In Europe there's been a great interest in the last 10-15 years around cluster policy, and the number of programs have been developed. There's also been a staff working paper from DG Enterprise and something called the European Cluster Memorandum that was launched about 2 years ago. If we look at the role of clusters in the different policy areas, we could say that sometimes it plays a very important role and sometimes a less important role. If we talk about policies around environment, and social policy and energy, clusters typically play a rather little role in those policy areas. But if we go up to competition policy and trade policy, or for example export promotion policy, it becomes much more important. And if we turn to innovation and science policy, regional policy and industry policy, clusters can play a very particular and important role. And sometimes we talk about policy for clusters, and that can be innovation policy and entrepreneurship policy, etc. And sometimes we talk about cluster policy. We will talk about all these things today in more detail. And for this I brought Dr. Ketels here from the Institute for Strategy and Competitiveness at the Harvard Business School, who is a world-renowned expert on cluster policy. So, as we said, there's a great interest now in cluster policy. What are they really about? What is cluster policy today?
Yeah, thank you, Örjan, for having me on this program. What I'll try to do is help us to look a little bit at the different aspects of this. This is a very appropriate time, I think, to discuss cluster policy. It's the 20th anniversary this year of Mike Porter's book, Competitive Advantage of Nations. It's also the 20th anniversaries of Giacomo Beccattini's book on industrial districts. At that time, we started to learn more about clusters, which was the topic of the first program in the series. But then immediately politicians started to get interested and try to understand how can we use this instrument, how can we use this tool in order to really help our regional economies, how can we help our national economies, how can we help our companies. Now as you look how this developed over time, at the beginning there really wasn't much structure to talk about cluster policy. So it was more an art. We had individuals in different countries trying to figure out how you could use these new tools. Some were very successful, others were less so. So there was a period then where in this learning we really relied on a couple of individuals who were convinced that this was a new interesting way forward, while others stopped doing it and looked for other ways. Interestingly, I think over the last 5 years or so we really have seen a renewal of interest in clusters and really much more systematic thinking about cluster policy. The questions that we ask ourselves about cluster policy have changed over time. In the beginning it was a lot about how do we avoid the traditional types of distortions that are associated with many industrial policies that have been tried over the years. I think now the question is much more about impact. How do we make sure that things we feel are useful actually do have sufficient impact on the communities, on the companies that we rely them on. So we have seen an evolution over time in the quality and nature of cluster policies. Now your question was, what's really the nature of cluster policies? And I think it's useful to go back and really start with first principle of economic theory. Why is there a case for cluster policy? Well, at the heart of clusters, and therefore also cluster policies, is a market failure. We have a lot of local externalities, and that's the reason clusters really start to exist. What are the type of externalities that we see? Well, there are information asymmetries. So if one company, for example, invests in a new technology, some of its suppliers or peers in the region might not know about it. Some of the research institutions might not know about it and may not make the right kind of complementary investments. If there would be information sharing, more efficient investments would be made in this group of companies. The same is true if you look at coordination failures. So we are not aligning our decisions in this group of co-located institutions and companies as we should for the best type of outcome for the region. Now, what are the answers? If you ask economists, they usually say that you have to target the externality at its source. There are two ways to do it. One way is, well, if there is underinvestment in a particular type of activity because of these externalities, then the government can step in. So that's why we talk a lot about targeting public policy at clusters. A lot of the industrial policy today is either targeted at individual companies, which is highly distortive. We know that we hit the target, but it's highly distortive for competition. Or it's across the board. It's really horizontal types of policies. Those are not distortive, but we know that their impact is relatively limited. We probably waste 80% of the investment that we take. Cluster policies are a way to be more efficient in the way that we target our government intervention. The alternative is really to try to avoid the externality, create really joint platforms for collaboration, for information sharing, and that way ensure that the decisions that are being taken in the cluster are really taken with a view on the externalities and the effect that my action has on others. And those are the two main elements of cluster policy. What we see in reality is that there is often a mix of both. Let's look a little bit more deeply into what are examples of areas in which cluster policy has been used. Now, one of the areas is workforce skill development. We all know that especially advanced economies are struggling with how do we come up with sufficient amount of people to work in the companies that are educated in the way that the market needs them. Now, the traditional approach has been very broad-based educational programs. We've seen that they don't really meet the needs of the companies anymore. The demands of the marketplace are changing very quickly, and we need to have a tighter interaction between the educational institutions and the different types of companies that operate in different clusters. Now, a number of countries have now worked with integrated cluster-based workforce skill development programs where you become much more impactful in order to provide the right kind of people with the right kind of skills to companies in your region. Another example is investment promotion. We know that in the globalist economy, we need investment, not just to get in capital, to get in new technology, but also to create better bridges, better access to foreign markets. If you go out and look just for any companies, it's very hard. In fact, there has never been a time where there were so many competing regions with a relatively good offer than we find now if you're looking for investors. But if you're specifically looking at how do we add the missing puzzle, the missing piece, to our regional economy, you're adding more value for yourself, and you're much more likely to really hitting the investors that are interested in coming to your location because they immediately see the partners in your location. So that's one of the examples of how government policy is being transformed through clusters. Cluster initiatives is another very important point where you really create platforms for collaboration. They take various forms of and shapes and pursue different types of activities. We have a special program in the series devoted to cluster initiatives. Now, one of the key issues that I already mentioned in the historical debate of how cluster policy evolved is really this debate about distortions. And to understand a little bit more why people are so concerned about cluster policy, or some people are concerned about cluster policy, I think it's useful to go back to a very simple schematic of how we see the impact of economic geography, of clusters on economic performance. So on the graph that you'll see, you have on the horizontal line, you have the agglomerations, the strength of clusters. So the further you are to the right, the stronger your clusters are. On the vertical axis, the higher up you are, the stronger your economic outcomes are. That could be wages, it could be employment, it could be other measures of economic performance that ultimately help prosperity in this region. What we know, and I think what there is an emerging agreement on in the academic community, is that there is a positive correlation between the two. So usually you get a benefit from agglomeration and specialization in these cases.